Welcome to our audience. One of the key features of today's global economy is an offshore world, the financial structures, institutions, and techniques designed to provide secrecy, asset protection, and tax exemption. While its worldwide impact is very significant, Africa is affected to an unusual extent by the strategies of tax avoidance and evasion, of outward financial flows, both legal and illegal, and corruption enabled by the offshore world. This is corroborated by a number of quantitative studies of capital flight, as well as by influential investigations such as the Pandora Papers, the Panama Papers, and the Luanda leaks. The Economic Commission for Africa and the African Union worked on the so-called Mbeki report on illicit financial flows in 2015, and over the years, other organizations such as the OECD have raised this matter repeatedly. However, there is a sense that the real consequences of offshore strategies for Africa are still misunderstood. Western governments continue to lecture African states on good governance, even while their financial centers scoop up African financial flows. Asian states claim to be different from Western states, while their companies and financial centers resort to the same strategies. And African leaderships claim to fight offshore flows, while often using these strategies themselves. To discuss these matters today, this event features three major African experts in this field. We will be dealing with the impact of illicit financial flows and offshore structures on the continent's development prospects. Our first speaker is Professor Attiya Waris, who was recently appointed the UN Independent Expert on Foreign Debt and Human Rights by the Human Rights Council. She holds a PhD in law and is a specialist in fiscal law, policy, and development. She is the first female director of research and enterprise at the University of Nairobi. Professor Waris teaches at the law school of the University of Nairobi and has also previously taught in South Africa, Rwanda, Malaysia, and the United Kingdom. Khadija Sharife, our second speaker, is an investigative writer and editor at the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, the OCCRP, with a focus on global illicit financial flows, political economy, and ecological predation. She is an associate with Open Secrets, a board member of the Platform for the Protection of Whistleblowers, Financed and Covered, and part of the UN panel of experts on whistleblowers. She's the author of Taxes If You Can, Africa, Ecological Economics from the Ground Up, and other publications. She has a Master of Laws and is a Yale Poynter Fellow in Journalism and a Yale Global Justice Fellow. Our third speaker is Tutu Alicante, who's an Equatorial human rights and anti-corruption advocate. Tutu is the founder and executive director of EG Justice, a nonprofit organization that promotes the rule of law, combats kleptocracy, and demands accountability for human rights violations in Equatorial Guinea, including through national, regional, and international forums and tribunals. Previously, Tutu was an employment attorney at the Southern Migrant Legal Services, where he represented migrant and seasonal farm workers in the U.S. South. Tutu holds an LLM from Columbia Law School and a JD from the University of Tennessee. So we have a great panel ahead of us. We will have introductory remarks from all three speakers. I think each speaker will speak about 10 to 12 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for questions from the audience. If you can see at the bottom of the Crowdcast platform, there's an Ask a Question button. You can write in your questions there, and I'll read out the questions. Typically, we have a very large audience of participants, so we will probably not be able to go through all the relevant questions, but we'll try our best. And it will be great to hear your comments and questions later on in this event. And without further ado, I'll ask Professor Waris to start her presentation.
Thank you very much, Ricardo, for the very kind remarks. I hope you can hear me clearly.
I can hear you well.
Okay, super. Sorry, this is the reality of living in a developing country. For a couple of days, we had no electricity. And so every time we are online, we have to do the check just to make sure everyone is with us. So it's a pleasure and an honor to be here with all of you today and with such a wonderful panel with old friends and some new friends also. And as Ricardo pointed out, I was appointed in August as the UN independent expert on foreign debt and international financial obligations and their implications for human rights, specifically economic, social, and cultural rights. I'm going to speak in two specific directions. First, I'm going to introduce the mandate a little bit because very often when I speak in spaces that relate to finance, often people are unaware of the existence of this particular mandate at the UN, which is based on the Human Rights Council. Next slide, please. And the second part of what I'm going to speak about is about the whole area of illicit financial flows, debt distress, and its interconnectedness with development and often survival of states across the world. So I fall under the Human Rights Council. My mandate is about 27 years old. And as I pointed out, it's about a linkage between not only foreign debt, but international financial obligations, is where, of course, the issue around illicit financial flows comes to play a part. And then this connection, not just to foreign debt for its own sake, or illicit financial flows for its own sake, but for the purpose for which it can serve to actually improve lives, reduce poverty, and of course, bring in development. Next slide, please. Although people see these two elements as being part of it, the fact that my mandate covers the international financial obligations means that it covers much more. I look at everything from ombudsman processes at the IMF to whether or not gender issues are taking place, to looking at issues around access to information on fiscal data and how that is playing a part in different parts of the world. My mandate requires me to produce a series of reports, some that are required by the Human Rights Council. For example, next year I will be submitting draft guidelines on the repatriation of state assets on the one hand. On the other hand, I also do country visits and give advice to states that are trying to understand how to better resolve their foreign debt issues, as well as illicit financial flows, and to ensure that the resources are properly used to alleviate poverty in their countries. So what is today about? And I don't want to talk a lot. I really want to have a great discussion with everyone. So illicit financial flows, unfortunately, is a contested definition. So what I do is I look at everything that anyone possibly thinks would fall under IFF. And the broad definition for me is about tax avoidance, tax evasion, but also bribery, corruption, and issues of asset recovery. However, while
My apologies to the audience, the connection has been poor. I think it's probably best for us to move on to Khadija and then perhaps we can come back to Atiya when the connection is reestablished.
Okay.
Would that be fine?
Yes, my internet karma is worse than hers.
Well, for now it's holding, so let's hope for the best.
I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, but it's such a fascinating topic, and it's something that most people's minds have considered. So I would just ask, what is illicit? As an investigative journalist, to me, it appears to be the character of a thing, and something that may not necessarily be illegal, but which is against the purpose of the law. So when we're investigating something, we find that all around the world, capital owners or shareholders, and they can be criminals or corrupt politicians or Machiavellian corporations, and usually all are interconnected and camouflaged. They are conferred a legal privilege that us as stakeholders, ordinary citizens, activists, journalists, and even law enforcement officials don't have. So if you're a shareholder, you have a legal privilege that normal human beings don't, and that kind of illicit theater often plays out in three ways, more, but we found three ways. Number one is that the law has not yet anticipated it, so it's not legislated against within a nation state, or the legal precedent has considered it, but it's still a gray area and it's subject to X, Y, and Z. And keep in mind that some companies have law firms on big retainers with more lawyers and more experts than a revenue agency may have. So just going up against one big multinational company is enough to capture all of the energy of a revenue agency. And the third, and this is most common, is that something can be illegal within a nation state like South Africa, but the activities have been conveniently outsourced to another jurisdiction in a way that is technically legal, but also cloaked in legal and financial secrecy. And in each of these cases, because we're talking about illicit finance, I want to keep in mind that asset recovery is less than 5% globally, even after the funds have been found, because of the cost of recovery being so prohibitive. So let me give a few quick examples that are very recent. Zimbabwe was crippled by fuel shortages for a decade. It wrecked the economy. So ordinary people could not drive their cars. Farmers who need fuel could not farm their crops. And how did this happen? In 2013, a Swiss-based commodity trader called Trafigura obtained a near exclusive deal with the cash-strapped Zimbabwean regime. Trafigura provided the fuel, but they also extended prepayments of more than $1 billion at very high interest rates. And the regime obviously kept defaulting, 16.5% interest rates. Now, the prepayment circumvents all of the multilateral debt ceilings because it's an advance payment, is not really a loan. And so it kind of skirted around the so-called rules of the global transparency, the world that we think we live in. And the near monopoly allowed for Trafigura to act as price makers. So they got this deal by getting a fixer for the dominant political party by the name of Tagurai. He's now sanctioned. And over this decade, they paid him $100 million in a Swiss bank account, Pictet Bank. And Trafigura ensured their former staff would handle it on behalf of him as the local player. And he was never caught out because the correspondent banking system allowed for a bank in Mauritius to make US dollar payments to the US and to Switzerland in ways that circumvented the law. JP Morgan is only required to check their client bank, not the clients of their client bank. So this economy, which suffered from more hyperinflation than the French economy after the French Revolution. The French Revolution introduced a new empty currency. Zimbabwe had more hyperinflation than France after the revolution, and that economy was effectively broken because Trafigura could act as price makers, dominate the economy, and effectively break it for cash. We could talk about another example of Angola, which Ricardo has written about very extensively. The former vice president, and before that he was the head of Sonangol, they really created and financed a lot of private banks in Angola, which was siphoning the oil money. And they did this because Sonangol would, become a shareholder of the bank, and then those shares would be gifted and they would be overvalued. So the share structure was one way of laundering money. But early on, the US Senate had found that they were trying to use HSBC and other banks. So what these guys did was create their own banks in Europe, specifically in Portugal, which was also cash-strapped at around that time. And less than 200 Angolans who were banked, mostly siphoning public money, became shareholders of Vicente and Copalipa and other banks that were based in Europe. Now, because they own the banks, the money launderers who were the clients were also the shareholders. They could effectively use Portugal as a springboard into the European Union in ways that the EU never anticipated money could be laundered. And of course, they control the information. So when the Bank of Portugal had this ordered document, because the Portuguese government itself wanted this money, nobody acted on anything. And it's ironic that it followed the legacy of colonialism, Angola to Cape Verde, shell banks, and then into Portugal, where it was laundered out. So this system was intrinsically problematic, it was systemic, and it required a lot of private actors and European governments to turn a blind eye, which they did. Just Atiya touched on the issue of debt, and we know Mozambique's infamous multi-billion-dollar debt scandal. These debts were very high interest rates. We know the roles of the bank. We know Frelimo, the dominant party, as in Angola and Zimbabwe, the dominant party allows for kickbacks to be structured as payments through shareholding empowerment schemes. They got $10 million. The Guibuza kids, they got private properties and big joint venture deals. For example, in South Africa, an estate agency, Pam Golding, helped them acquire 50-60 million rand in properties just for the kids alone. But what we haven't heard about is the role of the so-called foreign investors. The hedge funds like Goldman Sachs and even smaller ones like Ice Canyon, they invest in this kind of sovereign-backed debt as a frontier market. It's high risk, high rewards, whether it's mixed in as a collateral loan obligation or it's an LPN. They agree to big boy letters where they say the interest payments on the sovereign debt that is so high risk is 6%, 10%. And so in a short period of time, the hedge funds that are basically unregulated in the US, which is 90% of the world's bond market, they are able to make more money in a short period of time than they would with a stable vanilla government bond that generates 1%. So the US government tried to prosecute and say, our foreign investors lost money, they were duped. No, the hedge funds create frontier markets for high-risk debt that comes from African economies like Mozambique, which had just discovered gas. And although it was it wasn't registered with the US Securities Exchange Commission, they used their funds that were domiciled offshore in Ireland and Luxembourg, and of course they clear it offshore. So we can see that in all these ways, whether it's money being stolen from natural resources like oil, whether it's commodity traders bartering the future prepayments for debt, or whether it's collateralizing your resources, again, under odious debt, there are so many ways in which Africa's future and its development is stolen by private actors that play a very deliberate role. And we've seen with Credit Suisse, OCCRP just did a project called Swiss Secrets, when banks who only care about liquidity know they are going to have their neck on the block, they push up their legal budget. Credit Suisse did it by 85% in 2020. So crime is a cost of business for these banks that only care about their liquidity. They know national governments have ceiling, there's a lack of access to cross-border information, there's political and judicial corruptivity involved in almost every Machiavellian deal that corporations do. And even if it's not the corporations, organized crime cartels camouflage themselves using the same contradictions and escape routes that corporate companies do. So when we are doing investigations, and I'm wrapping up, we usually come across two sets of illicit actors financing this parallel landscape. There's the banks and the accounting firms and the law firms, the state agencies, art auction houses, and they legitimate illicit capital as stealth capital. They perform in a hyper-mobile way by outsourcing branches to secrecy jurisdictions which cannot share information with the onshore economies. So you have the banks and you have the accounting firms like Ernst & Young that handle their dirty business in Dubai or in Luxembourg, and those jurisdictions conveniently prevent them from disclosing this information. Ernst & Young did this in Dubai, which received the bulk of illicit gold from Africa, including Sudan's Jebel Amir mine, which was the basis or one of the key factors of the Darfur genocide. The mine was based in North Darfur, the third biggest in Africa. 300,000 people are displaced, people are coerced. $2 billion worth of gold in 2013 was exported to a Dubai-based refiner, and Ernst & Young knew about it, and they whitewashed it. So we know that these guys base themselves in secrecy jurisdictions to containerize their information. They are big clients of these jurisdictions. And secondly is that while we've come across, Mauritius and the BVI as the really bad island economies, what these guys have done is commercialize their sovereignty towards legal and financial secrecy in ways that serve the powerful onshore economy and actors. And why do we say this? Because if somebody has their money in the Seychelles or Mauritius, we know in the case of Malaysia's sovereign fund scandal, 1MDB, they laundered $1 billion through the Seychelles. The Seychelles offers unregistered bearer shares, so it's effectively litigation immune. But nobody will keep their money in the Seychelles because of the debt to GDP ratio. If a bank collapses there, the economy, the government cannot bail it out. So these island economies are pass-through jurisdictions for money that, like Taguirai, like the Angolans, eventually ends up in Europe. Politically stable tax havens where the government backs it and can sort of bail it out. So when we're looking at the small island economies, we have to think about the financial paper waves and look to FDI stock and flow. And where it flows tells us who benefits from this problem that has so often been misdiagnosed. For example, EITI tells us how much the company did pay to government, which might have stolen it, but not how much the company should have paid. The Kimberley process tells us when a militia group is dealing in diamonds, but not when the government is a partner with a company like De Beers. In South Africa, De Beers undervalued their diamonds by 33 billion rand in a period of 5 years. And they used heavily institutionalized lobbying to prevent royalties legislation from coming into force. So South Africa by 2011 was the only country in Africa that didn't have a royalties bill. And it's supposedly the most advanced with the most sophisticated legal and financial infrastructure. So I'll stop there. But at the end of the day, very often you find that these kinds of stories must be investigated through leaks that come to the media. And it won't even come to the government because 90% of African countries have no substantive or existing whistleblower laws. There's limited access to information. There are corrupted judicial system. There's very vulnerable or weak anti-corruption agencies. So we find that the role of the public sector is removed into the private sector. It's intended to regulate. The corruptors are the ones who are supposed to police themselves, and the criminals have learned from this and they have camouflaged themselves in those same corporate structures. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Khadija. Fascinating. And it should be added that a lot of the revelations that Khadija is referring to are the work of the OCCRP and of Khadija herself on several of these stories. So thank you very much. I'll give the word back to Atiya. Atiya, I'm glad to see you're back. Let's start exactly where you were before. And
okay, so I'm really sorry the connection dropped, but I'm cognizant of the time. So I'm gonna not look at my slides now as much. I'm going to point to 3 particular issues. And I'm so glad I caught Khadija's discussion, because it's Khadija talks about the real life, on the ground, practical implementation of what the research and the technical work is that I do at both the UN, but also in the research work I've been doing over the past 15, 20 years. So after this particular slide, if you move to the next one, what I was trying to figure out as I was looking at the issue of IFF is this is a global problem. But our conversation is about Africa. But you will not hear Khadija talk about Africa. I will not talk about Africa, because the conversation cannot be about Africa. It has to be about the world. And then it cannot just be about states. It has to be about the human beings that are working in specific spaces within institutions, states, by themselves, and how they are using their decision-making processes to actually push illicit financial flows in a certain direction. And sometimes it goes in one direction, and other times it goes in the other. And as the examples that Khadija has been giving, it hops, steps, and jumps over multiple jurisdictions. So it is a global problem. Now, the moment we agree that it is a global problem, it means it needs a global solution. And there's a lot of data out there on the figures. It's on the slide. But in 2019, I published a book that took me 15 years to work on. It's called Financing Africa. And when I pulled together the data, the struggle was, we can have these great conversations, but the fact of the matter is, if you go and try and look at what is the publicly available information that a person can find, whether they're in Africa, Asia, or Latin America, or even Europe and North America, they are not going to find information that will even allow them to make clear decisions on who they elect into power, on whether or not the person in power is making financial decisions that are going to help them or help their country or harm another country. And for me, this is really the crux of illicit financial flows. If you go down 2-3 more slides, please. So then why is, for me, human rights so relevant? Next slide, please. And for me, the most important part of illicit financial flows or foreign debt or international financial obligations is, it's not that we should be so angry about it. Yes, we must be angry, but it is about the fact that people are losing their lives on the ground, or they are going through horrible realities because we cannot put money where it is needed. And I think for me, this is why human rights becomes so incredible, and why my mandate becomes such an exciting place to try and bring together these connections. And it couldn't have been brought to light more effectively than during COVID. So I'll periodically refer to my book. So in Financing Africa, I looked at the commitments that African countries had made to spending parts of their budget on health. And only 5 African countries have actually managed to commit 15% of their GDP to health. And the rest vary between 5 and 2 or 0.2%. And this was before COVID. And you will see the same 5 countries are the ones who actually fared a lot better during COVID because their systems were that much more robust. Now, if we look at scenarios like that, then we realize that taking on debt, taking on not handling illicit financial flows, not regulating all of these international financial transactions is going to really result in an undermining of a system, not just on a normal day, But when there's an emergency, it can cause the crash of a country. Now, we are moving into, some people will say, a post-COVID era, but I don't think Africa is post-COVID yet. But you're now starting to see this enormous debt that has been taken on by countries, further fueled by COVID debt, which has also not had a lot of accountability. Next slide, please. And the result of that is what I try to distill into a set of principles. So I believe that countries, continents, institutions, it doesn't matter what you're looking at, we need to have fiscal legitimate processes taking place. So I've used these principles before. Transparency, accountability, and responsibility are the good governance principles. Effectiveness and efficiency, but so important, even though I put it at the bottom, fairness and justice. And the moment we compromise those, whether we're the individual working in a bank somewhere, or we are the president of a country, or we are a person walking down the road allowing corruption to take place, the moment we compromise these principles in our system and we say that you can exchange one for another, which is the process we've been taking forward, we will lose it. And I believe that we need this basket of justice and fairness to carry all of these principles forward. Next slide, please. And if we don't do that, then you're going to start to see IFFs feeding into debt distress, which is actually the exact example that Khadija is giving, the connection and the loop that is happening over and over again. And you're seeing it even more highlighted now than before. There are countries right now that are in extreme debt distress. And there are several African countries right now who are on the IMF's watch list as being within an ambit of complete collapse. And we need to take this really seriously, because there are people who can survive on $2 a day, but we are people in an audience who do not survive on $2 a day. I don't even think many of us could survive on $2 a day. So can you imagine the reality of people? And then if I take you to what are the tax brackets in some developing countries, the first tax bracket is everything you earn. There is no tax break for even the first $1,000 or the first $100 a month. So that means you could be living on $2 a day and you're paying at least 10% tax, if not more. Next slide, please, which is my last slide. And I'm so sorry for all the lost time as well. Last slide, please. Right, so thank you. So these interconnections are so important and they're so valuable. And on the one hand, we've talked about the people who are facilitating the system, but I want to end with the people who are trying to unpack the system, who are trying to fix the system, and who are trying to make things a little bit better. And there are not enough voices in the room. And I think that it is so important for people to make this connection that illicit financial flows and debt is not a Southern issue. It's not an African issue. It's a global issue. And that every voice counts. So even if people do not believe they are part of this process, they are. We are making decisions. You use a bank that has been dealing in this behavior, you have a responsibility to think about why you deal with that bank. And I think I'm not calling for any drastic reactions. I'm just calling for taking an ethical standpoint on a lot of these issues, because even the human being right at the bottom can make a really big difference. But thank you very much for the time, and I am again very sorry for the connection. Ricardo, back to you. Ricardo, you're muted.
Sorry. Thank you, Atiya. And I think the point that you made about this being a global issue chimes with Khadija's comment, because this couldn't possibly happen without the role of enablers, of facilitators, in mostly, until recently, mostly Western financial centers. And sometimes there are governments which wittingly or unwittingly have tolerated, sometimes have actually welcomed these illicit financial flows. Khadija mentioned Portugal and Luxembourg in her presentation, but obviously we know the examples of the United States, the UK, of Switzerland, essentially all major Western financial centers, and more recently some Asian financial centers are playing a really, really absolutely instrumental role in this regard. So I hope we come back to this in the Q&A. Tutu, your turn.
Thank you very much, Professor. And it's really an honor to be here. Up until yesterday, actually, I wasn't sure I was going to be here, and that's because 2 weeks ago, I lost a dear friend, someone with whom I've worked in the human rights circles and anti-corruption circles for the last 2 decades, basically. He passed away in Europe. A story I might come back to, but that loss of such a big human rights figure for us, had myself and many of us really shocked to the point that I wasn't sure I was going to be here. Well, I'm glad to be here. This is an important conversation. I think for him, it is important that I'm here. And if I may, one thing I want to do is put an even clearer face, a human face, to the people that Khadija and Professor Waris have talked about. And I want to talk about 3 men. I want to tell you a story about 3 men. One of them, the first man, was born in Equatorial Guinea. And he was born in 1968, the same year that Equatorial Guinea was becoming independent. His uncle was then the president of Equatorial Guinea, a man whose totalitarian regime carried out atrocities that are on par with what happened under Pol Pot in Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. When this young man was 11 years old, his father killed his uncle and declared himself president. Now, this young man didn't go to high school, but when he turned 19, his father named him Minister of Agriculture and Forestry. And as oil was being discovered in Equatorial Guinea in the mid-1990s, and oil actually turned Equatorial Guinea into what was once known as the Kuwait of Africa, the country with the highest GDP per capita on the continent. His father, this young man's father, had already succeeded in capturing the judiciary, capturing the legislative system, the military, all the agencies of the state, to ensure that corruption was not a factor in the system, but corruption was the very system in which this country was to develop, given this oil, right? So this young man, given that system, went on to amass a wealth so vast that it allowed him to acquire multi-million-dollar mansions in the US, France, Brazil, South Africa, Switzerland, 2 yachts, both worth over $100 million, over 50 sport cars, luxury items, watches, artwork, including famously the Michael Jackson memorabilia and diamond-studded gloves, jackets, hats, and what have you. So that's one man. The second man was born in Calgary, in Canada. And in 1969, the same year that the first man was born, this second man was graduating from Harvard Law School with highest honors. And he was moving to Beverly Hills, California, and joined the California Bar Association, where he became a renowned real estate lawyer. Now, these 2 men, the first man and the second man, met in 1990s in California when the first man was living a luxurious life in hotels in Beverly Hills and Santa Monica at the expense of oil companies in Equatorial Guinea. So the California lawyer, the second man, helps set up dozens of anonymous shell companies in the US. With the craziest name, my 2 favorite was Sweet Pink Inc., Beautiful Visions Inc., right? But this second man go on to facilitate the laundering of approximately $300 million, the purchase of the private jets, mansions in Malibu, the luxury cars, etc., etc. This second man, the lawyer, accompanies his clients to several parties at the Playboy mansion in California and at mansions in Malibu where they have white sharks and tigers and all sort of stuff to entertain the partygoers. Now, the third and last man that I want to talk to you about was born in a poor village in Equatorial Guinea. He was born in 1955, and he lived through the last 3 years of Spanish colonialism in Equatorial Guinea. He also lived through the first 11 years of independent Equatorial Guinea under one of the most ruthless presidents. The same person that I mentioned, his regime was on par with that of Pol Pot in Cambodia. This third man was born to a poor family, but with hard work, determination, he manages to go and study in Europe. So he eventually becomes a very, very good doctor. He specializes in obstetrics and gynecology. And in the 90s, as oil is discovered in Equatorial Guinea, he decides to return home, leaves his job in a prestigious hospital in France, returns home, hoping to make a difference, right? Now, the government refuses to allow him to work at the public hospital because he did not belong to the political party in power. So he opens a small private clinic, and he goes on to deliver hundreds of kids, cares for hundreds of women in the country. Hundreds of men also come to him. He becomes the physician for most of the embassies in Equatorial Guinea. He becomes the physician for the UN agencies in the country. He basically becomes the go-to doctor as HIV, AIDS, Ebola, and most recently COVID spreads throughout the country. So here's a man who dedicates his life to improving maternal health, decreasing infant mortality, ensuring that preventable diseases do not kill his patients. Now, the three lives, or these three men, their lives are inextricably linked by one thing, and that is kleptocracy, right? Transnational kleptocracy, right? The first man, Theodorin, this is the man who has relentlessly stolen through embezzlement and through extortion, has disappeared hundreds of millions of dollars out of Equatorial Guinea to acquire these super expensive toys. He lives between Tangiers and Genoa and the Caribbean islands in these private yachts. And this can be seen in his own TikTok and Instagram updates every single day, right? The second man, who lives in a rule of law nation and has gone to an elite academic law school, has now specialized in circumventing laws so that he could facilitate the illicit flows of millions from places like Equatorial Guinea or Angola or Congo, Brazzaville, etc., to places like the US and Switzerland and France. So meanwhile, the third man, this is the man who returned to dedicate his life to bringing children into this world, is running a small clinic that lacks the most basic needed supplies, right? Often he has his generator running in the background to ensure that his clients can stay alive. He has been framed several times. He has been arrested several times. He has been tortured several times. He has been in prison twice. This man was diagnosed with prostate cancer 3 years ago, right before COVID. He was able to, before that, he was able to go to Europe to seek treatment, but as COVID restrictions were imposed, it became impossible for him to travel. And as his situation deteriorated, it became clear to us that this man was going to die. And soon enough, we moved this man to France eventually, and he died on the 24th last month. We buried him on the 5th this month, May. Most people that think about kleptocracy, that think about illicit financial flows, have an image of Theodorin, the first man, the flashy kleptocrat with his Lamborghinis, his yachts, his gloves, and all that. I think increasingly, thanks to the work of many people around the world, including people like Professor Waris, more and more people are beginning to pay attention to the second guy, the lawyers, the accountants, the bankers, all these image laundering PR specialists, they provide the quintessential, the sine qua non role without which millions of dollars would not disappear from developing nations back to Switzerland, France, US, UK, etc. The people who often are not featured in these conversations, when we're talking here in the US about legislation and all this stuff to curb corruption and illicit financial flows, are the people like Dr. Wenceslao Mansogo, right? When some of us say that every single dollar that flows illegally out of a country is $1 less that's available to combat poverty, we're thinking about people like Wenceslao Mansogo, right? People that are dying of diseases that a country where the highest GDP per capita still on the African continent should be able to deal with, right? But this is the reality that illicit financial flows have created. And I've talked to you about Wenceslao, but my own sister, Chiquitina, died in a hospital, bled to death because there was no electricity and there was no doctor in sight, right? So this is a reality that happens every single day to people in Equatorial Guinea and in every single African country in most of developing nations, right? A couple of days, with the help of the National Endowment for Democracy, we launched a paper that I published with Ned 2-3 years ago, I can't remember. And the title is "To Catch a Kleptocrat." And in there, I'm talking about the importance of strategic litigation to combat this cancer that we have identified here. People like my friend Wenceslao Mansogo, just 69 years old, should not be dying of prostate cancer in a place like Equatorial Guinea. But until we can put our heads together, wrap our heads together and figure out how to not just write about and be amazed about the Lamborghinis and the yachts that Theodorine flashes around the world, but go after the George Naglers, the lawyers, the accountants, all these middlemen, all these enablers of kleptocracy, and think about the real effect of people like Wenceslao. Why is it that the IMF is giving the Equatorial Guinean government $280 million, a loan of $280 million, when we know about the kleptocratic nature of this government? Where do they expect that money is going to go, right? So there is work to be done for us to figure out how do we bring cases like my friend Wenceslao, who is gone now, but there are hundreds of families that rely on him as a doctor. There are hundreds of children that rely on him. There are hundreds of... How do we bring their stories to front? How do we ensure that these illicit financial flows do not contribute to these inequalities in our country? And that's a conversation I look forward to having. I look forward to talking to anyone that is interested in about strategic litigation. And I know from this conversation, many, many more ideas will come. And again, it is a pleasure to be here. And I'm glad I decided to come here. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you, Tutu, and especially under the circumstances, we are even more thankful that you could join us today. Thanks for a very powerful, insightful presentation. We have several questions waiting for us. I just wanted to start with a more general question before opening the floor that I think it relates to different points that all three of you addressed. So perhaps this is, I'll start with Atiya, but perhaps we could all three deal with the question, which is bearing in mind the centrality of the role of, let's call it, metropolitan financial centers in the processes that you described. Where is the reform thrust coming inside, developed economies? Do you see a reform thrust? There's been talk of pseudo-reform for many years, and yet the realities that you described are not from 10 or 15 years ago, but they're current ones. Where do you see transformational dynamics happening, if at all? We could deal with the African dimension later on, but since Atiya and others underline the extent to which this is genuinely a global problem, where is the global reform thrust coming from? Atiya?
I think that's, for me, that's probably one of the most important problems we're facing right now. So I'll give you the example of my mandate at the UN. My mandate at the UN is probably one of the most divided mandates of the UN, in the sense that it is supported by many countries in the global south, but countries in the global north will officially make stands and say, we do not support the existence of this mandate. We feel it is misplaced. I mean, and this is recorded during Human Rights Council sessions at the UN. So this is, I'm not speaking off the cuff, this is not rumor and speculation. But what I find fascinating is the same countries that will make those standpoints, whether officially and then of course sometimes unofficially with me, will be the same ones who will now say, oh, you know, we need to resolve the issue of IFF, sometimes in public spaces. And then I think to myself, well, you know, I don't see a connection. I don't see countries making connections. So more and more often when I'm having conversations with countries across the world, because this really is a global problem, I see a disconnect within state processes. So the people working within the ministries of finance and treasury, the cabinet, don't make a connection with the ones working on development issues or rights issues or poverty alleviation related concerns. And you see this constant repetition, not only at national levels, you see it at regional levels, and you see it at global levels. So currently there's been a new call for the creation of a global tax authority. There's been a new call for a global tax treaty. And it's a very hectic and it's a very heavy discussion. But again, the divide is so clear. So I don't know how people are going to reconcile this with them. And I thought when the whole issue around COVID vaccine inequity came out, for me, this was a wonderful watershed moment. It was a reality. There is no single person in the world right now who doesn't understand the fact that the right to health requires money. And that money is not just right to health, it became right to life. It meant people were dying. But I will tell you that right now on the African continent, we are on average at 10% vaccination. And those 10% are either frontline workers or people with connections, the elites. So now here we go again. We're back in the same dilemma again. So I don't see many countries actually coming to the table with a coherent policy. And I think for me, that is the biggest problem. And when I'm having conversations with states, I ask them, I'm like, well, does your development team come into the room on this discussion? But you see, this battle, the siloing, is a whole global battle. And you see it over and over again. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Khadija. Sorry, thank you, Atiya. Khadija, where's the global thrust coming in the global north at any rate?
That's a good question. I just wanted to touch on something that Tutu mentioned and Atiya. So there is a contradiction in capital, and the contradiction in capital says that the United States and other governments must support long-term authoritarian regimes like Equatorial Guinea and Chad and Gabon as stable business partners for their investment through their big oil and gas companies. And they do this in order to protect their own democracy. We can see that right now the Ukraine is at the tip of the tongue because of Russia's onslaught on that country. So as devastating as that is, there are a dozen countries in Africa that are currently under the same onslaught, but it does not receive the same media attention because somehow Africa has been reduced to a bargain bin where we have an endemic incapacity. And that goes, I think, to your question, where's the thrust coming from? It's coming from the large electoral democracy countries that will protect their own economies with any means necessary. And that means misdiagnosing the problem so that the solutions can protect their interest. So very often solutions like country by country reporting speak to a small segment of the OECD rich person club. And unfortunately, this also means that the conversation is limited to money or cash, not the character of things, how they are executed. So for example, ecological predation, which includes oil and gas, And we forget that ecological systems sustain life all around the African continent, water sources, arable land, even mangroves and forests to protect against storms. And because these are financially unmonetized to Western companies, it's viewed as useless. But even where it's criminally engaged, we find that major banks never file suspicious transaction reports for things involving massive timber trafficking, for example, from the DRC or Angola, where often there's corrupt companies and politicians involved. So the financial flows driving the model is not something that the big Western democracies diagnose as the problem. They don't look at the financial flows driving the model. They only look at the physical act of killing the rhino or taking down the tree. So there's a great distinction and a delinking of how the financial system drives this model in a technically legal way or an illegal way, and who's benefiting from it. And just as an example of that, we can see that even the Norwegian sovereign fund that is considered the cleanest in the world, they have divested from illegal logging, but they are investing in the banks that are driving the illegal logging, which then displaces people and culls down very, very endemic and scarce species and their forestry habitats. So at the end of the day, to really understand who is diagnosing the problem, in whose interests, for a world where the rules suit them so well. Africa, as Atiya said, civil society and individual citizens need to have more agency weighing in on those problems that are being diagnosed elsewhere for the benefit of elsewhere, while we here suffer the consequences of it in big and small ways. And that is the contradiction of capital. And just to wrap up, major arms suppliers like the United States, their biggest clients is Saudi Arabia, one of the major exporters of extremism. And they supply the conflict zones in Libya and Sudan. The United States is not party to the Arms Trade Treaty. And we see that a lot of their clients buying the US arms are the ones causing the problem. The bulk of the OPEC's clients, their member states, are not only the biggest suppliers of oil and gas in the world, but they are the biggest buyers of arms, and they are the greatest exporters of extremism and conflict. So all of that goes into the contradictions of capital, what the people who are diagnosing the problem will do to protect their democracy, and who suffers the consequences of that diagnosis.
Would you like to add to that? Do you see any reform thrust coming from the global north?
I think I just killed everybody with my rage.
No. I think Khadija has beautifully articulated what I myself see as a problem, right? So there's very little I can add. I think one thing, there's definitely inconsistency. There's definitely hypocrisy, right? Because the US knows exactly what lobbying firms are representing these kleptocrats. It is clear what law firms, what lawyers represent these kleptocrats. In fact, when the US Senate
Professor, if those two are offline, could I ask you a question? How do you negotiate your very difficult
they're
position?
not offline, everyone else is online.
Okay.
Everyone else is online.
Oh, sorry. So what I was just going to say, when there was a US Senate investigation looking into the activities of Tedorin here in the US, and all the lawyers, all the accountants, the bankers were in the room and pled the fifth and did not have to testify and walk out of the courtroom, out of the congressional room, and that was it. Not a single lawyer, no one else was held accountable, So yes, some countries are now beginning to pass some legislation, whether it's sanctions, economic sanctions and travel sanctions and bans. But that is not enough, because they're still using many of these sanctions regime as a political tool, basically, as one more arm of foreign policy, as opposed to a real arm to combat kleptocracy, right? So as long as that remains a problem, there is a lot of room and there is a lot of inconsistency in what the US and UK and France say and what they do.
Thank you all. And now we're going to open the floor, and I'm just going to, we have quite a few questions. I'm going to, some of them we'll take them as comments. A question by Bernadette O'Hare. The question is, great point, specifically Professor Juarez, that we all have a role to play regarding our consuming banking voting choices. Any thoughts how we get this message to a broad audience? And it's interesting for us who work in this field that we take this more or less for granted. But there's important parts of what we're speaking about here today that don't break into the mainstream. How can that happen? And because we have quite a few questions, if we can deal with each individual question, each speaker as briefly as possible, that would be great. Atiya?
You bring three passionate people in the room, and we will do our best to be precise. Bernadette, that's a really important question. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when I started working on the connections between finance and the use of the money, everyone thought I was crazy. So I have to tell you that we've made huge steps forward. No one thinks I'm crazy anymore. So it's very comforting. But I will tell you that is you cannot stop. You have to keep speaking in every single space you can get a place in, and you have to keep highlighting it. And I think that use your agency wherever you are. If you are voting in a particular space, if you're buying shares from a particular country, from a company, sorry, then do it with knowledge of what you're investing in. I mean, ethical behavior is really the only thing that is going to guide us at this point in time, especially because you cannot regulate everything. And it's going to take way too long for us to regulate. So whatever change you want, let's do it now. And I will tell you is that suggest names of people who can speak about these issues in those unusual spaces. So identify them and kick open those doors, not only for yourself, but for others. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Atiya. We won't ask every speaker to speak to the same question, but this I think is a particularly important one. So I would like to hear Tutu and then Khadija on this very briefly.
Khadija?
The question, Khadija, is any thoughts how you can get this message across to a broad audience, which is, I think you have a lot of experience in, of making these realities sometimes can seem technically very intimidating, but OCCRP, both through your website and through publications in mainstream newspapers, you've done an amazing job in explaining just how this matters for everything else. Are there any lessons for a broader public understanding in the global north, but also in Africa, where many people don't know about how important this is for their daily life?
Yeah, I think very quickly, the people who are at the center of the problem pretend that they have a very specialized language, accountants and this and that, and they pretend that only they can understand their language. So the first thing to do is to strip away that uselessly important respect and break open their vocabulary on the record by publishing the mechanisms that they use, because it's not a fantastical genius vocabulary, it's just a trick. It's like learning a different language. So once you put it on the record as a journalist and you've exposed the mechanism, and journalism always often falls into the problem of looking for the scandal, but not for the systemic problem. So once you put the systemic playbook on the record, then that momentum is there and ready to be built. So the civil society, the people who focus on advocacy, on the real human lives, the professors and the development economists, the public intellectuals, they can then use these as very real case studies to show what is happening in the world, because we live in a world of branding. There's a lot of transparency. There's very little accountability, because what has been put on the record is often rubbish. So as journalists, you are a historian, you put the information on the record, and then the really important people like Tutu and Atiya can build on it and take it forward to the spaces that matter for the change that must happen in our space and time.
Thank you. Tutu, if I may, I'd like to hear you on this question, but there's already another question which is somewhat linked, so it would be interesting if you could address both. The question is, what have been some major successes in the last few years, if any, and who were the key actors who drove those successes, if any? It's a question by Oscar Brusset.
Perfect. So on the first question, as someone that runs a small non-NGO that's often looking for interns and looking for resources, I think there are many civil society organizations throughout the world trying to do this work with very little resources, right? Fighting corporations and fighting politicians with millions and millions of dollars at their disposal to hire law firms, etc. Right? So if you're a student, I think the first question was coming from a student. If you're a student, there is something tangible that you can do by aligning yourself with a small NGO trying to do this work in Congo, Brazzaville, or in Venezuela, or wherever. So there is something tangible over there that students can do. And if you're not students, you're professionals. So definitely, there are many things that you can do, whether through NGOs, whether if you're a professor, certainly in academia, providing these spaces for these conversations to be had, etc. So there is a lot, and I'm happy to talk to this individual if they wanted ideas, if there's a way for them to get my information, etc. On the second question, I alluded to the paper that I wrote about, to catch a kleptocrat. And in that paper, we are discussing the BM Malaki case. The BM Malaki case is a case involving actually 3 regimes, Congo, Brazzaville, Gabon, and Equatorial Guinea, where investigators in France discovered millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars in assets by all these kleptocrats in France. We eventually work with the French authorities. So by we, I mean Sherpa, which is one of the law firms in Paris, Transparency International France, Easy Justice, work with lawyers over there, and we were able to bring this case. And after about 12 years, the vice president of Equatorial Guinea was convicted of a crime, convicted of money laundering, fraud, etc. The very first time in which a sitting government official is held criminally liable and convicted for a crime of corruption. That to me is a huge success, which is why I decided to write that paper and share that, and we have now translated into French, Spanish, Portuguese, etc. Because people need to understand, right? And what made it successful was precisely the journalists initially wanting to do that investigation and coming up with a report that documented all that. The lawyers at Sherpa and lawyers at Transparency International figuring out, we need to talk to people in this country, find people that can testify, etc., and bring these cases. So what happened over there, I think, can be replicated in many other places, but it requires what I mentioned earlier, right? Working together, figuring out who are the lawyers that we need, they're interested in this, who are the funders. This takes, if you're able to take a case through the French judicial system for over a decade, it requires a lot of money to pay lawyers, to pay civil society folks, to pay. So it requires resources that, the likes of Ford and OSI and who have you have. So it requires us to put our heads together, but that can be done, and I think forums like this create those synergies.
Thank you, Tutu. Briefly, Khadija, this question: major successes in the last few years, if any, and who was responsible for them? I see Atiya's just written in the chat box a couple of 3 very successful initiatives whose ongoing work is in many ways admirable. I don't know if you have something to add maybe on the investigative journalism front.
Yeah, I mean, with OCCRP, the investigations are almost written like criminal dockets in a surgical way, because you are specifically targeting jurisdictions that will act, whether it's sanctions, whether it's freezing assets. And in that way, because OCCRP is publicly funded, it serves 2 purposes. Number 1, to hold them to account. And number 2, to allow for governments to begin effecting legislative accountability in many ways. But I have to say that even where these things happen, a lot of the times these are figureheads or specific companies. And unless the legislation changes, unless the law begins to anticipate and not react, the same thing happens. So as a journalist, you know that any so-called success is momentary, and that the people who are in civil society have to take it forward for systemic change. So you don't really look for a success, you look for the first step that's happened so that the others can take the next step.
Thank you.
May I add something?
Of course, please do.
So there are 2 things that I'll hear Tutu and Khadija saying. And it reminds me of the problems that I've been seeing in the system. The first is the issue of racism. And I think it's a very hard word to put out there. But 2 years ago, I published an article on racism in the international tax system. And frankly, there is racism. And we have to face it. I mean, it is what people really are like. And this is why I always talk about the human beings who are at the center of the issue. At the end of the day, we are accountable. We are not trusts. We are not companies. We are not shareholders. We are human beings making decisions. And racism is one of the biggest problems I see in international tax systems, in how the treatments are taking place, in how decisions are being made. The second thing, which I think is, and I see it also in the questions, and it's a real problem, is so there are so many actors doing so many different things, but it comes back to what Khadija is saying about the need to make legal change. So only about 18 African countries even have transfer pricing rules. So that means that in the remaining 35, 36 countries, transfer pricing actually falls under IFF because it's completely unregulated. So it won't even be in IFF because it's not illegal. So even when we're doing these calculations of how big IFF is, it is actually a drop in the ocean of the actual bigger problem. And it's about the legislation. And then I want to remind us, this issue of whistleblower protection is actually really critical. Not enough right to access information across many African countries. I think also about 18 only have it. But even the ones that have the right to access information don't actually have the right to access financial information in those countries. So you can ask for other information, but you cannot get budget data. You cannot get how money is being spent, even nationally. These are quite a few.
Sorry. Mentioning for the audience is that transfer pricing has almost never been involving an African company or foreign corporation in Africa. Has almost never been criminally proven. So this is literally something one gets away with every single time thus far, or almost. It's truly shocking in its scale, especially in regard to the extractive industries. I would like to alert the audience, as some of you can see, that one of our participants, David Lawson, has kindly posted the excellent paper by Tutu, To Catch a Kleptocrat, that Tutu mentioned. It's really a great paper, and I suggest that you read further. I'm going to now read out a question by Ian Gary, who heads the FACT Coalition. Ian writes, the spotlight on Russian assets hidden in the West can be leveraged for reform efforts in the West that can have much broader applicability to deal with kleptocracies around the world. In other words, not just Russia, but everyone else. Any suggestions on how best to leverage this moment, this Russia-centered moment, and in which spaces? At the FACT Coalition, for example, we are looking at the US-hosted US-African Leaders Summit later in the year to make sure the concern about kleptocrats is not just limited to Russia and Ukraine. In fact, this is a great question, and it would be great, again, very quickly to hear from the three of you, and I'll start with Khadija.
I think with Russia, we've heard a lot about the PMC Wagner in Africa, and it's been greatly sensationalized. So we have to try to understand what is the truth from what is the politically correct sensationalization. So with Russia, for example, we can see that they have used Dubai for their major energy company, Sovcomflot. And we know that they really need to sell their oil for foreign currency that will not be taken by the United States, by the Western governments. And so by using Dubai to conceal the provenance of the oil, they have been able to continue making money in that way. So the same problem that affects Africa, Zimbabwean diamonds and Sudanese gold, is the same problem, that's the same mechanism that's allowing Russia to continue through Belize, through Cyprus, through Nevis. They have restructured their parallel economy, which is the real source of their power, using the same escape routes. So while we call them offshore jurisdictions, they are simply commercialized sovereignties that support onshore actors, the banks, the accounting firms, the estate agencies, And until those loopholes and contradictions are legislatively closed, for example, Atiya mentioned transfer pricing. Many African countries have a double taxation agreement with Mauritius, which allows for them to legally shift all of their profits. Vodacom in Mozambique. So that country will forever continue having high prices, very little tax revenue, and GBC1 companies in Mauritius that are tax-free, while the politician gets to have exceptional dividends from Vodacom through the same Mauritian entity. So we need to make sure that there are natural sanctions against secrecy jurisdictions across the board, starting with our own country. Otherwise, these problems continue. You can look at Russia, but Russia is using the same loopholes as everyone else. So the loopholes need to be closed.
Thank you. Tutu, on this question.
Yes, I love that question by my good brother, Ian. And Ian knows that, I've always said this, right? As someone that works on Equatorial Guinea, it is a problem that I have to peg Equatorial Guinea's problem to Russia or to China to get any notoriety, any action, right? We have a situation here where the US knows fair well what's happening in Equatorial Guinea. And the UK has even taken the step of sanctioning these young men, Theodorine, right? Yet, because the US wants oil from Equatorial Guinea, and I'm sorry to be so blunt to my American friends, they won't sanction Theodorine, and Theodorine is likely to become the president of Equatorial Guinea by next year when we have presidential elections, right? So the fact that, I have to figure out how do I use the leverage that Russia, Ukraine has now to talk about Equatorial Guinea is problematic, and it highlights the issue of racism that Professor Waris was talking about, So, but it is a reality here in the US that unless we do that, we're not going to get the attention that we need, So, and Ian knows that, I remain open to figure out where should we be going to talk about this, who are the lawmakers that we should be highlighting these issues in front. There are all these issues of asset recovery, asset repatriation concerning in Equatorial Guinea. All these $1 million they have now seized, and the U.S. Treasury and France, etc. How do we get these funds to do the work that needs to be done to ensure like people like Wenceslao can take care of unborn children and mothers, etc. So I don't know the answer to Ian's questions as to how do we get that type of leverage and where should we be going. But I don't think that should be where we should be going. When you have the UN putting out documents about that, why this is a problem in Equatorial Guinea or in Venezuela or in Bolivia, wherever, that should be enough for us to get the sort of answers that we need.
Thank you, Tutu. And I think Ian Gary's question points to the fact, I think we can say this 2.5 months after the start of the Russia-Ukraine war, that the conversation in the US, in the European Union and the UK about Russian oligarchs and retaliation against Russia has not thus far led to a wider systemic conversation about kleptocracy. It's very bespoke. There's no willingness for now to have a broader, more structural conversation. So the search continues for solutions in this regard. Atiya, I don't know if you want to add something to that, or can we move to the next question, please?
Of course, I want to add something to that. I'm sorry. So I think that it's a really important moment because we're talking about kleptocracy, but I want to widen this conversation because for me, it is about illicit financial flows. And whether it is somebody who we think is a kleptocrat, and because I'm a lawyer, we say suspected kleptocrat until proven otherwise, okay? The problem is that money is moving in multiple ways across the world. And this particular crisis is showing us what happens when middle and upper class people are faced in a conflict situation. Now, in the case of Africa, very often it is not the middle class and the upper class that move as fast. And if they do, it is a very low amount of money. So it doesn't hit national headlines or global headlines that quickly. But in this scenario, it is huge amounts of money and it's a big population moving with it. And for me, this is a moment where we have to talk about the digital economy and how digitization is facilitating the movement of money. I mean, there's huge controversy around cryptocurrency, and without naming either of the two countries, the middle and the upper class in those countries that are involved in the war actually are moving with digital wallets to survive. Now, this is illicit financial flows. But this is illicit financial flows that has been set up by a government in order to allow their population to survive. So, there's the good part of it, and then there's the bad part of it. So we have to be aware of it. But how do we now deal with it becomes the problem. Well, I'll take you back to my slide about fiscal legitimacy. We need to have a set of clear principles where, whether we're at the UN or we're at any other entity across the world, when decisions are being made, they are following a set of principles that allows for an egalitarian approach to the problem, which is why for me those 7 principles become so important, because that is what allows us to then make a rational and hopefully as unbiased as possible decision. Thank you, Ricardo.
Thank you. That was excellent. I have a question here from Dr. Medina Nadefru. You have presented, I see Atiya has also given some suggestions in the chat box. You have presented many of the entrance challenges of economic development in Africa. Could we now proceed into research on workable and transformational solutions to at least reduce these funding impediments on the continent's development? So let me slightly restate this question, and I think this is a good question for Atiya as well, which is we're moving on with the diagnostic. There's something sometimes demoralizing about the diagnostic because as shown, for instance, in the work that Khadija has been doing, there are so many subterfuges, there are so many strategies, there's so much innovation by the so-called facilitators. Every time you think you plug a hole, a new one opens. From a public policy perspective, and without genuine global buy-in for solutions that are just not country specific but are genuinely global, can this be dealt with, or is this just a part of the global landscape as we know it? You mentioned, for instance, cryptocurrency. That's a separate question, but I mean, how does one deal with that in the world as it is rather than as it should be? Is there workable and transformational? Are there workable and transformational solutions, in the words of Dr. Medina Nadefru? Go ahead.
Thank you. I presume you smiled because I smiled. All right. So yes, there are absolutely transformational positions. So a lot of people think that the solution is to go straight into the global spaces. I'm actually working on a report for the General Assembly this year, looking at the need for a global fiscal authority and the need for global fiscal convention. And there is a call for contributions out. I'm very open to having different way of thinking around it. But I see that one very important transformational space on the African continent is actually the AU and the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. And the reason I put the two of them together is that both of them separately have been working on IFF-related issues, but they don't, again, the siloing of spaces means that they haven't brought it together. So there are resolutions of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights on IFF, multinational corporations, and the effect that they are having on the ability of countries to grow, develop, and even alleviate poverty. And at the other hand, at the AU level, they had the high-level panel on IFF. And I think we're well overdue a review of that high-level panel, which I hope they will do. It's 7 years on now. And so bringing processes like that together can be really transformational, because we are already at the forefront as the continent in the world that is actually taken steps to document and have political decisions on IFF. And pushing those arguments forward at a political level is really critical. But then how do you transform downwards as well? We've got regional hubs, and the RECs are becoming very powerful. The East African Community, SADC, COMESA, I mean, all of these are really great spaces to get a cohesive position forward. And I don't know if people are aware, but a couple of years ago, when we were trying to have a joint position on health issues, the African continent was actually the only continent that managed to pull together a joint position with each country contributing at first national, regional, and then continental level. So we have this ability, we just need political will to push it through. And I'm very positive. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question which I should ask Atiya, but I'm going to ask Khadija because I think you've sort of answered that question, which is about Africa collective action in this space. And I think I take it from Tutu's and Khadija's presentations earlier that certainly the Angolan government, the Equatorial Guinean government, and the Zimbabwean government are not reform champions in this field. Where do you see the African thrust of reform? For instance, 7 years ago, I mentioned earlier, the European Commission for Africa published an influential report, the Economic Commission for Africa, the ECA. But it's been a silent actor over the last 5 years. It hasn't really been a major presence in this field. It has been the African Union, but particular parts of the African Union. Some African governments do find this agenda important, others less so. Tutu, how would you map out the internal African conversation, especially at the level of governments and international organizations? We've already surveyed the global North dimension. How do you see the evolving African dimension here?
Yeah. So Professor Waris mentioned initiatives at the African Commission on Human and People's Rights and at the African Union that I was unaware of. I have always thought, for instance, right now with all the conversations on sanctions, it strikes me that, none of these African governments are talking about that, right? And you are correct. Unfortunately, governments that Khadija and I have discussed, not only are they not champions, but they're going in the opposite direction, right? Here you have a situation like in Equatorial Guinea where Yahya Jammeh of Gambia commits all these atrocities and does whatever he wants with the national treasury of that country, becoming a billionaire and he owns a mansion right next door to Obiang. And then he's now in Equatorial Guinea enjoying retirement and what have you, right? So we're going in the other direction. I think there are a few countries out there, I think whether because there's still a semblance of rule of law, so I take even South Africa, right, where they were willing to put together a commission to investigate these type of cases. So places like South Africa, places like Ghana, I don't know what the situation is in Kenya specifically, but there are a few governments out there that I think has the capacity, still have enough of fabric of democracy to have these discussions. And when you have some reformers in government, advance some initiatives. I think as a whole, collectively, I am unaware of anything that even any of those countries are doing to move these conversations along on the continent or even in the regional level. To some extent, one could say, the SADC region or CEMAC, they are governments, they care about these issues, but even regionally and stuff, I haven't seen it. I haven't heard it. I don't know if Professor Waris disagrees.
Atiya, would you like to say something there?
Yes, I disagree. Sorry, Tutu. But okay, so when you look at the political spaces, especially on the continent, there's two or three ways countries react. I hope you can obviously not.
Okay, yeah.
So the first way is that they do nothing and they just hold position. I mean, because the politics sometimes can be extremely fraught. Then you have the ones that take a step backwards in a particular direction, or let's say take a step in a direction. And then there are others that then take a step in a different direction. So you can imagine it more like a star with spreads going in every direction. What I have noticed is that from a political perspective, African countries are more likely to hold position and then when under intense pressure, take a step back. So I'll give you the most recent example of the OECD multilateral instrument. The entire debate around it was for the past X number of years during the last during the Addis financing for development process, the deadlock was the deadlock was the Global South wanted the creation of an international tax authority. The compromise was, well, there's already this process at the OECD, there's BEPS going on, it will resolve these issues. Then the OECD rolls out and says everything will be by consensus. And now what you have a couple of months ago was a treaty being passed where there isn't consensus, where countries like Nigeria and Kenya, amongst others, actually refused to join in. Now, the word consensus means everybody in agreement. There is no new definition of consensus. And this is where Khadija talks about, jargon and unpacking jargon. But here's the other concern, is a reinterpretation of words to suit particular situations. Now, that refusal by Kenya and Nigeria to consent, for me, was them holding the fort. And I think sometimes we are not, because I want to say it really carefully, I think that many countries are not so good at communicating with their populations and their citizens, with the result that when they take action, sometimes that is positive, they are unable to actually communicate its positivity to their populations. And I think that is where we have to understand our nation states and understand that whole space. So that's one. But I want to say that I'm very supportive of financing for development. I know there's an echo. Give me a second. Okay, right. So this fourth financing for development process is going to be, for me, will be a watershed moment, because the reason we didn't succeed in the in Addis Ababa was because of this process. Now the process has failed. So the world must listen to it. When they listen to it, they must respond to that. So I think we have to be a little bit careful. But Tutu, send me your address and I will send you my book. Clearly you need to read it.
Thank you, Atiya. We're coming to the end of our event. I wanted to save the last question for Khadija, who I think left us for a little bit there, and then we'll bring this to a close. Khadija, you mentioned Dubai. It also resurfaced a little bit in other conversations. How important is that connection today to African economies from the perspective of what brings us here today? Is it part of a wider set of new financial centers, perhaps not the ones that we'd be traditionally concerned with? Do these new financial centers pose particular challenges? Is it more of the same? If you could wrap up with just a couple of brief remarks in that regard. I'm aware this is a huge topic, but we're out of time, unfortunately.
Yep. I think in terms of secrecy jurisdictions, it's important to understand the role that they perform. So Dubai, for example, has a large cash for gold market.
I'm sorry, this has been, the event has been plagued with technical difficulties. I still think we managed to get the best of our contributors. And I'm sure that many of you will be following developments in this field and will have other opportunities to engage the speakers. Let me just close not only by thanking the three speakers, and I'm very sorry that Khadija is not here with us to accept those thanks, but Tutu, thank you very much. Atiya, thank you. And I wanted to remind the audience that we have another event coming up on the 24th of May, the title of which is Illicit Finance and the Role of Professional Enablers in the United Kingdom. Are Things Finally Changing? And the speakers are Andrew Mitchell, MP, and Dame Margaret Hodge, MP, both of whom are at the forefront. They chair the relevant all-parliamentary group in the House of Commons, and they are at the forefront of these matters in the UK, and specifically in dealing with the enablers of global corruption. So I think that's going to be a very, very interesting event. They're not pussyfooting around the subject. They're very, very outspoken, both of them. So I think it's going to be worthwhile. Thank you very much, and hopefully see you very soon for other events. Thank you.
Indeed. Thank you.